Teenagers mock an elderly man at Burger King. What happens next leaves everyone in shock. A heavy silence settled in the air as three arrogant teenagers fixed their amused gazes on an elderly black man sitting alone in the corner of a Burger King restaurant. What started as a simple meal was about to turn into a life-changing lesson, one so powerful it would leave every witness speechless. No one could have imagined that beneath the fragile frame of this man, with his trembling hands holding a simple hamburger, lay a heroic past. A past that was about to resurface, forever altering these young men's understanding of respect, sacrifice, and true strength. The restaurant buzzed with life. Families chatted joyfully. Couples exchanged smiles over their meals, and the vibrant energy of youth filled the air. But in the farthest corner, at a table meant for two, sat Mr. James Thompson. At 72, time had left its mark on his weathered face. His presence seemed out of place in the flashy, youthful atmosphere. His simple, slightly faded clothing contrasted sharply with the expensive brands and stylish outfits around him. Slowly, he chewed his sandwich, savoring each bite with silent gratitude. His tired yet dignified eyes observed the world around him, while his calloused, age-spotted hands held onto his meal with quiet strength. At a nearby table, Logan, Tyler, and Bryce, three privileged 13-year-olds, exchanged smirks as they turned their attention toward the old man. Dressed in designer clothes, showing off the latest smartphones, they embodied everything privilege had to offer. "Hey, check out Grandpa over there," Logan sneered in a hushed tone, just loud enough for his friends to hear. "Bet he's counting his coins to see if he can afford dessert." Tyler laughed too loudly, drawing glances from nearby diners. "Maybe we should donate some spare change. Looks like he needs it more than we do," he mocked, dramatically twirling a $20 bill between his fingers. Bryce, always glued to his phone, smirked as he quietly lifted his camera. "Live poverty in real time. This is going to blow up my profile," he muttered, adjusting the angle to capture the elderly gentleman unnoticed. Several people nearby noticed the boy's behavior. A mother shook her head disapprovingly. A few patrons exchanged irritated glances, but no one intervened. It was one of those moments where everyone recognized the cruelty unfolding, yet chose silence. Near the entrance, however, Dr. Evelyn Carter watched intently. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. She placed her glass down with quiet precision, though her flared nostrils betrayed her growing anger. Logan, emboldened by the lack of pushback, raised his voice. "Look at that coat he's wearing," he mocked, ensuring Mr. Hayes could hear. "Probably fished it out of a dumpster behind some shelter." The teenager's snickers grew louder, but Mr. Thompson remained unshaken. He continued his meal with dignity, though for a brief moment, a flicker of deep sadness crossed his eyes, a sadness that carried decades of untold stories. The boys had no idea they were about to receive a lesson they would never forget. Because Mr. James Thompson was not just some lonely old man eating fast food on a Friday night. And the truth about who he really was about to be revealed. What happens next will leave everyone in this restaurant forever changed. The air inside Burger King grew heavier as the tension in the room thickened. Mr. Thompson, the elderly man sitting alone in the corner, slowly lifted his gaze from his meal. There was something in his eyes, not anger, not shame, but a quiet sadness, as if he had encountered this kind of disrespect many times before. His lips moved silently, as though counting to 10, before he simply turned back to his sandwich. Meanwhile, Dr. Olivia Carter observed the scene with growing frustration. As a cardiothoracic surgeon, she had dedicated her life to saving people without judgment, regardless of their backgrounds. Watching these young boys mock an elderly man solely because of his appearance ignited a rare, controlled fury within her. "Let's take a selfie with him," suggested Ryan, adjusting the camera on his phone. "This would be hilarious for my next TikTok." Jason hesitated for a brief moment. Something like guilt flickered across his face as he noticed Mr. Thompson's trembling hands, but the peer pressure was too strong to resist. "Maybe we should ask him if he was in a war," Jason sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'm sure he's got some fascinating stories. Like, I don't know, collecting tin cans." Their laughter echoed, but this time, the mood in the restaurant had shifted. Other customers were now staring at the teenagers with open disapproval. A well-dressed man in his 40s rose slightly from his chair, as if preparing to intervene. Dr. Carter, however, had seen enough. With quiet determination, she set down her glass and stood up. There was something commanding about her presence, her upright posture, the sharpness in her gaze, that made people instinctively take notice. She walked toward the teenagers, her steps deliberate. Mr. Thompson attempted to rise as if to avoid further conflict, but his frail legs betrayed him. He stumbled slightly, gripping the table for support, his face tightening in pain. Instead of showing concern, Marcus smirked. "Look at him," he scoffed. "Can't even stand straight. Must be rough not being able to afford a decent cane." At that moment, Dr. Carter reached their table. The boys instantly quieted, though she was dressed casually. There was an unspoken authority in her demeanor that made their smirks disappear. "You three," she said, her voice calm but firm as steel. "Do you even know who this man is?" Jason, still trying to maintain his arrogant facade, shrugged. "He's just some old guy." "Is that so?" Dr. Carter's sharp eyes scanned each of them, her tone unwavering. The boys exchanged uneasy glances as murmurs spread throughout the restaurant. More customers had stopped eating, now fully engrossed in the confrontation. "What do you know about sacrifice?" she continued. "What do you know about risking your life for people you'll never even meet?" Ryan, suddenly uncomfortable, discreetly lowered his phone, as if ashamed to be caught with it. "This man," Dr. Carter said, her voice now quiet but weighty, "is not just some lonely old man eating a burger." She paused, letting the silence stretch. Her gaze lingered on each of them before she added, "And you're about to find out exactly who he is." The entire restaurant fell still. Every eye was locked on the unfolding scene. Mr. Thompson, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, once again tried to stand. With effort, he leaned on his table, steadying himself. "You don't have to do this, ma'am," he said, his voice deep and unexpectedly strong despite his frail frame. "I'm used to it." "But they aren't," Dr. Carter replied, not breaking eye contact with the boys. "And it's time they learned." She turned to Mr. Thompson and gently helped him to his feet. He accepted the support with quiet dignity. And, at that moment, the entire restaurant was about to learn a lesson they would never forget. They walked back to the teenagers' table, which now seemed much smaller compared to the chairs in the restaurant. The air was thick with silence, so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning felt deafening. "Allow me to properly introduce you," Dr. Olivia Carter said, her voice carrying both deep respect and restrained indignation. Her eyes shone with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "This is Dr. James Thompson." The word doctor hung in the air like a lightning strike. Jason swallowed dryly. Ryan lowered his gaze, suddenly feeling embarrassed. Marcus attempted to keep his expression neutral, but failed. Their once arrogant faces now displayed a growing unease. Dr. Carter continued, her voice unwavering. Dr. Thompson dedicated 45 years of his life as one of the most respected neurosurgeons at the Veterans Memorial Hospital. A hushed stillness fell over the restaurant. A woman at a nearby table placed a hand over her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. An elderly couple at another table watched the unfolding moment with admiration. During the Vietnam War, he performed surgeries under impossible conditions, saving the lives of hundreds of wounded soldiers, many of whom were not much older than you, Dr. Carter said, pausing to let her words settle. The silence deepened. After the war, he returned and developed a revolutionary brain surgery technique that is still saving lives today. "I know this because he was the one who trained me during my residency." Her voice softened, but the conviction remained. A surgeon is only as good as their heart. She let her eyes scan each of the teenagers before continuing. "While you laughed at his worn-out clothing, you had no idea that these hands performed surgeries that are now recorded in medical history books. You mocked a man whose hands spent countless nights in operating rooms, saving patients whom other doctors had already given up on." Dr. Thompson lowered his gaze. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet humility. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of experience. "I do not need you to tell my story," he said calmly. "We all grow old. Eventually, we all become invisible in the eyes of the young." He raised his hands, hands marked by time, hands that had once held human brains and repaired nerves finer than a strand of hair. He studied them as if they belonged to someone else. "These hands have performed over 4,000 surgeries," he murmured. "Now, they tremble when I pick up a hamburger. That is the natural course of life." At that moment, a young Burger King employee, no older than 20, hesitantly approached the table. His name tag read Tyler. He removed his cap respectfully before speaking. "Dr. Thompson," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "You operated on my mother 15 years ago. She had a brain tumor. The doctors told us she wouldn't survive, but you saved her." Tears welled in the young man's eyes as he continued. "She is still alive today because of you. I grew up listening to stories about the doctor with miracle hands who gave her a second chance. I never imagined I'd find you here." A murmur spread through the restaurant as people processed the weight of the moment. The restaurant manager, visibly moved, stepped forward. "Dr. Thompson," he said, clearing his throat, "your meal is on the house. It's the least we can do." Marcus, the most arrogant of the three teenagers, suddenly looked very small. His face, once full of disdain, now reflected deep shame. We didn't know," he whispered. "I'm really sorry." "Of course you didn't know," Dr. Thompson replied, his voice gentle but firm. "How could you? You saw an elderly black man in plain clothes, eating alone, and made a judgment." He sighed, choosing his words carefully. "It's not your fault. It's how you were taught to see the world." Dr. Carter stepped in, her tone now softer, but no less serious. "But it is your responsibility to question those assumptions, to ask yourself why you judge people based only on what you see." Dr. Thompson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "When I was your age," he said, looking directly at the teenagers, "I wasn't even allowed to walk through the front doors of the hospital where there is now a wing named after me. I had to fight for respect." His tired yet hopeful eyes met theirs. "So, tell me, what will you do with your privilege? Will you spend it mocking the elderly? Or will you help build a world where respect is not something that must be earned with so much struggle?" The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath. The sound of several people quietly wiping away tears filled the restaurant. An elderly woman at a nearby table nodded in silent approval. The heavy silence was finally broken when Riley, with trembling fingers, began deleting the photos she had taken. The soft tap of her finger against the phone screen echoed through the room, as if making the final judgment before a complex operation. What Dr. James Thompson would say next would forever change the lives of these young people. And everyone in the restaurant knew it. Before answering Jason's question, Dr. Thompson looked deep into the eyes of the three teenagers. The entire restaurant fell into a hushed anticipation. All background conversations had completely stopped. After a long pause, he finally spoke. His voice was gentle, yet firm. "You can do something." The teenagers leaned forward, desperate for a chance at redemption. Dr. Thompson gestured to the empty chairs at his table. "Sit with me. Share your time, not your judgment. Sometimes, loneliness wounds more than any insult." The simplicity of his request caught everyone off guard. This wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a public shaming. It was an invitation to genuine human connection. After hesitating for a moment, all three teenagers stood and followed Dr. Thompson to his table. Dr. Olivia Carter watched the scene unfold with a quiet, knowing smile. The restaurant gradually returned to its usual rhythm, though many customers continued glancing curiously at the unusual gathering. "You asked about my hands," Dr. Thompson began, extending them across the table. "Let me tell you about the first surgery I performed on the battlefield, under the roar of mortar fire, with nothing but a flashlight for illumination." As he spoke, the teenagers' expressions shifted. Their earlier mockery turned into fascination, then admiration, and finally deep respect. Riley, who had been so eager to ridicule the old man online, now listened intently, absorbing every word. I was 26, just a little older than you. The soldier on my makeshift operating table had a fractured skull, Dr. Thompson said, his voice thick with memory. He looked away for a brief second, reliving that critical moment. Every other doctor said he wouldn't survive the transport, that we should just make him comfortable in his final moments. Marcus, who had been the most arrogant, now had unshed tears in his eyes. "What did you do?" he asked. "I refused to give up on him," Dr. Thompson said. "I used techniques that weren't yet in medical books. I improvised tools from whatever we had." He paused, then smiled slightly. "That young soldier is still alive today. He has grandchildren your age." Tyler, the Burger King employee whose mother had been operated on by Dr. Thompson, returned with drinks for everyone. "On the house," he said, his voice filled with emotion. As the evening continued, something incredible happened. The teenagers began asking genuine questions, not just about medicine, but about life, about segregation, about overcoming prejudice, about what true respect really meant. "You're not angry at us?" Jason finally asked, his voice small and uncertain. Dr. Thompson thought for a moment. "Anger is a luxury I cannot afford at this stage in life," he said. "I prefer to spend my remaining time building bridges, not burning them." Dr. Carter, who had kept her distance during the conversation, now approached the table. "It's getting late, Dr. Thompson. May I walk you home?" He nodded, rising carefully to his feet. The teenagers immediately rushed to help him. "Before you go," Riley said, nervously fidgeting with her phone, "can we take a picture with you? Not to mock you, but to remember." Dr. Thompson smiled warmly. Of course. The photo was taken. But in it, there was no pitiful old man, as Riley had once intended. There was a hero, surrounded by 3 young people whose lives had been forever changed. A week later, in the same Burger King, the 3 teenagers returned, but this time they were not alone. Each had brought their parents. At the main table, accompanied by Dr. Carter, sat Dr. Thompson, visibly surprised by the unexpected reunion. "We wanted to thank you in person," Marcus's father said, shaking the retired doctor's hand. "Not just for everything you've done in medicine, but for teaching our children a lesson that we, as parents, failed to convey properly." Jason stepped forward and handed Dr. Thompson an envelope. "We started a fundraiser at our school," he said. "This is for the Neurological Research Fund." When Dr. Thompson opened the envelope, his eyes widened. The students had raised $400, a remarkable amount for teenagers. "This is just the beginning," Riley added. "We're launching a program where student volunteers will regularly visit veterans' homes and hospitals. We'd love for you to be our mentor." The same restaurant that had once witnessed the worst sides of these teenagers now saw their best. The transformation was not just in them, but in everyone who had heard the story, one that now spread through the town as a powerful reminder that respect is not about appearances. At the end of the evening, as everyone began saying their goodbyes, Dr. Thompson pulled the 3 young people into a gentle embrace. "You asked how you could make up for that night," he said softly. "You already have. Not by raising money or starting programs, but by proving that you are capable of growth, of becoming better people." And with that, a lesson that began with cruelty ended with hope. If this story touched your heart and made you reconsider the power of your words and judgments, share it with those who need to hear it. And remember, real change begins when we choose to look beyond appearances and recognize the humanity in every person we meet.